and issues that can be researched and discussed in the university, and foment research and groups in Oxford University. We have an academic event, Coffee and Science, maybe the Brazilian Studies program. And we'd like to organize some events to integrate students and the Brazilian culture. Alexandre, you are on mute. Sorry, guys. We do that very often. So good afternoon. I'm Alexandre Trindade. I'm the president of the Cambridge University Brazilian Society, or CUBS. Good night for people who is already in the evening. So good evening, everybody. In Cambridge, it's starting to become night. Mariana and I have the honor of being your hosts for your panels today. CUBS is organized by Brazilian Studies that has object as its goals disseminate Brazilian culture in the university and Cambridge University, socialize through events, debates about Brazil, support students and democratize the spaces we occupy so people from other places can access knowledge and perspectives from this traditional institution we are today. CUBS also has tried to promote relevant spaces in the Cambridge University so Brazilian perspectives can have visibility and highlights. In next week's, in 1st and 2nd November, CUBS will celebrate 100 years of Paulo Freire here, and it promotes a meeting and a contribution that is not have been done yet between academics and social movements about education in Brazil. 2 weeks of debates, dialogues, students' conference, cultural events, discussing emancipating education that was taught by Paulo Freire. And in first hand, we're giving you an information that in this celebration, CUBS will donate for this for the university a statue of Paulo Freire that will be eternized here in this institution and also celebrate. And Juliana is putting the links you can access to have more information and register for one or more events in this celebration. You can follow us on social media to know more about the events we are organizing here. And now we're going to Oxbridge and this very special panel we have today. Oxbridge Conference on Brazilian Studies is a multidisciplinary event that has people from academics from social studies, from natural science, and it's organized through Cambridge Oxbridge Society, as Mariana said. It had started in 2012, and due to the pandemic, that's the first year we are doing it online. What we understand is also an opportunity to democratize the access that was once restricted to people who could be here in Cambridge or in Oxford, even as a panelist or presenting their work or as an audience. Oxbridge 2021 was thought by this group that is organizing it as a plural space, able to promote diverse perspectives. Even if our focus is academic, we understand that the academy should be open to perspective and knowledge that are not traditionally formed here. We believe that through this value of the knowledge, we can make the academic space an environment able to have relevant contributions to society, especially through social sectors that have their voices, stories, mainly deleted, erased from history. We are discussing the impact of the COVID pandemic. We had health and science on Monday, society and economy today, politics and environment politics for next week, and we are going to have 3 panels on next week. Now we have a small moment to thank publicly our technical partners and also our sponsors that made this event possible. The Brazilian Studies program in Oxford, represented here by Andresa in the Oxford University.
E agradecemos também a Fundação Lema.
We also thank Lema Foundation e Ebrasa. Our moderator today is Pedro Mendes Loureiro. I'm going to introduce him and give him space to speak. He is a Latin American Studies professor in Cambridge, focusing on politics, economy, and his main research areas are the dynamics of inequality, including multidimensional and intersectional inequities, and critical strategic approach for development. His focus is Latin America, especially Brazil, Argentina, and Bolivia, but including works focused on other places. Thank you so much, Pedro, for being here as a moderator on this panel. The stage is yours. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alexandre, Mariana, all people who were organizing it. It's a huge pleasure to be here and take part in this event. It's a very rich event that's been organized here for almost a decade. I have been to other editions and it's always a pleasure. One of the things, as you have said, the pandemic brought us, but was also a positive issue, is this possibility of a bigger integration in events, academic and other events. It's very hard having a panel with people from many different places, but we are being able to participate together. So I thank for the invitation and the attendance of all the panelists and all the audience. Thank you so much. So our panel today, as said, is society and economy. We'll have three speakers. The first one is Maria Sylvia Oliveira, who's gonna talk about social inequity, pandemic and the access to justice. She's a lawyer working in human rights and gender issues, race and ethnicity, also fighting against domestic violence and familiar violence. She has a post-graduation in law, is a master's student by UFRJ, and member of the Geledés, the Institute for Black Women. Geledés is an organization that works to eradicate racism and sexism in Brazil, coming from the understanding that these processes, racism and sexism, systemically discriminate women and Black people in our country, and also affect negatively these people's chances in life. She's also part of the Black people movement. She's a feminist and a president of Race Equity Committee in Brazil. She's also a part of a lot of congresses and committees that are directed to social matters in Brazil. I'll introduce other panelists after Maria Silvia's talk, but we're gonna have Lygia Sabbag and Luiz Terena. They will be 20 minutes, and I will let you know when you have 10, 5, and 1 minute left. When the time is over, I'll show up speaking and talking to you. And so, Maria Sylvia, thank you very much. The stage is yours. Thank you very much. I'll start thanking the organization of the 9th Oxbridge Conference, and I'll do that through Alexandre da Trindade, that has contacted me with this honor invitation and the opportunity to speak about the impacts of pandemics in the Brazilian society, and talking specifically about gender and race. I also wanna greet my colleagues Lygia, Luiz Terena, and Pedro, our mediator. Also, all the other panelists that were here and that will still be here in our event. As Pedro has said, I'm a coordinator of promotion of equity of gender and race, Geledés. This organization was founded on April 30th, 1988. He has said about what we fight related to race issues. Due to that, we have followed the impacts of this sanitary crisis with no precedence in our Brazilian society, and especially in the lives of Afro-descendant population. This pandemic crisis that we are experiencing has really opened, shed light on the inequities a part of population used to experience, majoritarily they were Black people, in a historical process of exclusion, marginalization, and denial of basic rights to the Black people in Brazil. The rights to health, a decent housing, sanitation, water. And we now observe that a high part of this population could not actually be in lockdown or in social distancing. Around 35 million Brazilians don't have access to treated water, an essential item to avoid contamination by COVID. And around 100 million people don't have sewage collection. It's around 100 million Brazilians that live in a situation of food insecurity. And through the second consecutive year, Brazil has reached a record in the grain production, more than 273 million tons, projecting as the second biggest food producer in the world. And as a contradiction, I'm sorry, I don't know if you are listening to that, but there's a car selling something coming through my house, passing on the street. So in contradiction, we have a severe hunger situation in Brazil. Around 20 million people had returned to this platform of hunger. It's a significant increase in the number of people in the misery situation or extreme poverty. We know that promoting hunger is one of the strategies of body control, Black bodies control, a way of cutting off our capacity of being organized, and this has become a government politics in Brazil in the last few years. Geledés is part of an articulation with more than 250,000 organizations of Black movements called Black Coalition for Rights, and we coordinate the national campaign. If we have people hungry, give them food. It aims to have funds to emergency situations and hunger facing during the pandemic of COVID-19. This action receives money to have basic hygiene and food kits, to have the minimum food for more than 222,000 families in Brazil. They were mapped by the Black organizations that are part of our coalition. The assistant work that we need, it's an assistance work we need to keep going beyond the politics to guarantee the minimum for these families. Recently, I've read a text that states in times of crisis, women are the first ones to have their rights suppressed. In the intersection between gender and race, Black women and girls are the most hit by the suppression of rights. Before the pandemic, 33% of Black women were below the poverty line. In 2021, even with the emergency funds, this rate is higher in 38%. The proportion of Black men below the poverty line is slightly inferior to this rate. For the non-Black population, the poverty rate that was from 15% before pandemic has raised to 19% in 2021. But the levels of poverty are extremely lower among men and women that are white. The extreme poverty that hits 9.2 Black women in 2019 has raised it to 12% in this group. Among the men, it was 8.9 and is now in 11.6%, according to data from the Macroeconomic Inequity Research Center from the Economics University in USP. For white men and women, the rate is still very low, around 5.5% in 2021. The data prove that in Brazil, racism expresses in the complete omission of the state, which has highlighted in this pandemic moment, deepening the inequities in the past few years and increasing rights violation for Black people in a way that was much more expressive for women and girls that are Black. This population represents the main group in extreme poverty situation in Brazil. It's called a misery matriarchal. As said, Sueli Carneiro, with the same title, her article was made in September 2000. This expression, misery matriarchy, talks about the women's history marked by exclusion, discrimination, social rejection, and besides this condition, they keep their resistance and leadership work in their miserable companies in the Brazilian society. This text from Sueli Carneiro is really up to date, and it's scary. And it's really scary. After 20 years, the data we have said prove that we have a severe crisis in the activities that are formal and informal. And in March 21, Black people were 72.9% of people unemployed in the country, a total of 13.9 million in this situation. Even the numbers meaning a decrease regarding the third quarter of 2020, when we had 40 million people unemployed in the country, and people were 61% were Black people. So the percentage of Black people unemployed is really high, putting these people in Brazil in a high vulnerability.
And this put the women in a very vulnerable situation, and the women in Brazil are the most affected one. The research that has been carried out in São Paulo has shown that the risk of Black people dying of COVID, it was 25% higher than the white person. In Brazil, the institutional racism is within the constitution already predicted. However, the Black population do not have the material means to enable them to make full use of the rights that is allowed to the citizen in an appropriate state of law. And when we are talking about rights here, we are talking about the basic right to life. So the right to life is as expected as part of the most fundamental rights. So 1 year, 9 months after this crisis, we have over 600,000 deaths caused by COVID-19. And the response from the state to stop the advance of COVID, when we talk about the poor people, it was the measures implemented by the state were insufficient in quantity and in quality. And we have the vaccination the vaccination program advancing, but the Black people still are in disadvantage with the vaccination program. In March 2001, 3 million people, in March 2001, 3 million people, white people in Brazil has already vaccinated. However, among Black people in mixed race, they had only just over 1,200,000. So, and this is taking into account that the number of people in Brazil that declare themselves Black or mixed race. Brazil has adopted a vaccination program without taking into account the peculiarities of the Brazilian demography. And as a result, we have a great disparity when we look at the racial distribution among vaccinated people in Brazil. Education was one of the most affected areas of the pandemic. And in 2020, September of that year, we had 13.9% of the students in the primary and secondary school didn't have access to education. And this study has also shown that Black and indigenous people had the 3 times more the number of white students that didn't have access to education. So if you look at the comprehensive education in the country, so the state-sponsored education, Black and indigenous were not having access to education at that point. So if you look at the health impact in the lives of Black people in Brazil, and with the aim of looking at that, some studies were conducted in the state of São Paulo, trying to connect this link between gender, race, and health. And the study shown that the Black girls were the most affected one with the health impact of the COVID and education. And they were also the ones that were more exposed to violence. 70% of the Brazilian population will not learn properly, and this data will impact the lives of Black children who actually live a digital apartheid in the country. And this is a tragedy. There is a report called Acting Now to Protect the Human Capital of Our Children, published in 2021 in Brazil, deal with all these issues as well. Amongst the tragedies of the pandemic, we saw an increase on the number of people killed by the police. 75.6% of the homicides in Brazil are Black males from 15 to 24 years old. Just to give you an example, in May, a boy, 14 years old, was killed by the police in Rio de Janeiro inside his own home whilst he was playing with his nephews. Another police operation in May 2021, 1 year after the death of this 14-year-old boy that I mentioned before. So this police operation killed 25 people, all of them Black, also in Rio de Janeiro. So these are just 2 examples of how the Brazilian government is carrying out its security policy or national security policy. Parallel to that, we have a number of laws that are being approved at government level that dismantle the social policies in Brazil in the strategic areas that we have assistance and care to the population. And this assistance and care area are essential in the period post-pandemic, and that will lead many Brazilians, in the majority Black, who will end up more marginalized and poorer in the next few years. And finally, take into account everything that I've mentioned, we cannot count on the state-level institutions or lawmakers, law decision makers, when it comes to dealing with the concerns of the Black community to guarantee to this community progress in the future. We are living in a hostile environment when it comes to racial agenda in this current government. Therefore, our main challenge is to guarantee our basic and most fundamental right, the right to life, and to surpass this institutional racism in Brazil is within this death policies, this death policy in the Brazilian state. Do I still have time? It seems she does, and Maria continues. Taking into account the current landscape, we consider the social movements are considered anti-state, and in this sense, they are treated as enemies and they are criminalized. This is a strategy to inhibit the manifestation of these movements, and it is an attempt of silence the opposition. These are the movements that are resisting the violation of rights that is guaranteed by the international conventions and the federal constitution, and who is fighting against the dismantlement of the social care, and that is being imposed by the conservative forces in the Brazilian state. The Black Coalition Rights presented a report called Dossier Genocide and Dossier Black Genocide and Pandemic. And in this report, it is clear that the Black population are the most directly and indirectly group affected by the pandemic. And these are the group that has less attention from the state. Therefore, what we have to think is in terms of the possibilities in the future for the Brazilian Black population. I would like to finish this presentation by saying that we will continue to talk about this and to be invited to speak in such a space like this conference is a way of being able to talk about our struggle at an international level and to talk about the fight that we are carrying on, that we are fighting at the moment, and bring the solidarity to all of us that are hearing us right now. We count on your support to fight the historical racism in Brazil. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. So, Maria, thank you very much. It was a very clarifying presentation, as we expected. We are now going to hear Luiz Eloy Terena, who is our second presenter. He is the general, he's the secretariat of the General Council of Brazilian Indigenous. He has a postdoctorate from the INSEAD, France, and in his PhD essay, he talked about the awakening of the Terena people in relation to their rights. And he will speak right now. Luiz, it is a pleasure to hear you right now, and you have the mic. Please go ahead. I would like to thank you all for this invitation. I would like to thank Alexandro, Marina, Pedro, all of you who are here, and I would like also to greet my fellow panelists, Maria and Lygia, and not least importantly, I would like to thank you for this space. This for us is a very precious space to talk about the indigenous Brazilian people. I am from Terena people, and we are located at the south of Mato Grosso, which is in the center Midwest Brazil. I am part of the indigenous people. I had access to education via affirmative actions, and we went from our tribe to the university, and we are using this knowledge that we've got from the university to work with our indigenous organizations and our people. I would like to reinforce the importance of being here talking to you. So talking about the pandemic, COVID-19 impact on the Brazilian indigenous people is something that it is still continuing. So at the moment we are still dealing with that, but in 2020 that demanded from the indigenous people a capacity of interaction, because the background of the situation is that we have a government that is extremely harmful to the Brazilian indigenous people. As you know, there are policies that he created. We know that his policies is creating tools to negate the rights of the indigenous people, not only in related to the protecting their land and he has incentivized mining activities in the indigenous lands and the burning of the fire of in lands that belong to the Brazilian indigenous people. Besides that, he has incentivized the squatting into areas that are protected and already already part of the rights of the Brazilian indigenous. Besides that, the government has also has failed in protecting lives that should be saved. So it's with this in the background that we organized last year a committee called Committee of Life in Memory of the Indigenous Life. And of course, this is done parallel to the transparency of the state and denial from the government in attending the indigenous who live in lands that are not yet circumscribed, delimited to the indigenous people. And this also shows the racist behavior towards the indigenous people. So it is an administrative decision to consider as indigenous only those indigenous who lived on lands that have been already delimited. So I take this opportunity to talk about the ethnic diversity in Brazil, and based on the Brazilian National Statistics and Geography Office, according to them, we have over 300 Brazilian indigenous people, and we speak hundreds of different languages. And we have indigenous that are still isolated and have and we have groups that are still isolated without any recent contact in the Amazon. At the beginning of the pandemic in April 2020, we saw a report that it was published by Oswaldo Cruz Institution, showing the vulnerability that the Brazilian indigenous were living, be it because of the geography, so the different indigenous territories, they are far from the urban centers that have a better capacity to offer a healthcare for the victims of COVID-19, be it because of the political difficulties, the notion of sanitation demanded by COVID in the indigenous community, it was already precarious. We have indigenous communities that do not even access to treated water. They are surrounded by farms that produce soy and beef, and these communities, these indigenous communities, they are prevented to access the river. And when they have access, the rivers are already being contaminated by the activities developed by the agribusiness in the area. Also, COVID-19 had an impact for these people in terms of the social contact and the reality of the indigenous is that they live in a collective manner, and this is very similar for the poorer communities in the big urban centers, in the fringe of the urban centers in Brazil. The collective life is to live together. All of a sudden, they were isolated. And this, of course, was also a challenge for the indigenous people. So the indigenous people, they suffer a lot more at a biological level with COVID, because some of the indigenous Brazilians, they can be victimized by a normal virus of cold and flu. So you can imagine what a COVID-19 caused to these people, because they never have any contact with other people. And one of the things that it was very important, and even before COVID, we were highlighting that the Brazilian indigenous people, they do have the right to not have contact with non-indigenous people. So besides that, we also visualize that the government was taking advantage of the COVID-19 crisis. So the government was taking advantage of that to pass measures that would not be passed otherwise.
that allow the emission of limit declaration of bordering the indigenous land, ignoring lands that are being studied or that are already declared as indigenous, that are occupied by indigenous people and not registered yet, including some lands that have isolated people and that have all a decree for its use. Many indigenous that were affected by that. It's a decree that made the appropriation of these territories easier. Besides the highest number of people invading the Yanomami indigenous land, they talk about 25,000 prospectors, gold prospectors, and also in Mundo from Pará state, we had a lot of gold prospector. Deforestation has been a record, and it's being seen and demonstrated to all of us. APIB has taken to the Supreme judgment through the PE 209, a constitutional action for the first time in the history. Brazilian Supreme Court has recognized a petition coming directly from an indigenous association and has judged the case, determining that first, we would have the installation of a situation room in which should be discussed the installation of sanitary barriers for 33 indigenous lands from isolated and recent contact people. This room really worked badly. We needed a lot of decisions from Minister Barroso determining the installation of this room. And after a year, we still have a lot of difficulty of obtaining proof that these barriers have actually been installed. The level of discussion regarding the technical bodies in the government was really low. As APIB had Fiocruz, Brasco specialists, accessories, government brought their technicians and health technicians who were negationists, and it impressed us at that moment. And now seeing the CPI, we have a lot of documents that the technical body of this government denied accepting Fiocruz determinations. And those would be like respecting protocols to enter indigenous land, made the sanitary barriers with individual protection like alcohol gel, people in the barriers should be tested. Even that was really difficult. The government sent to the Supreme Court a list of barriers they theoretically had put. And when we checked, Brazilian government was considering warning signs as sanitary barriers, and they are actually not. The Supreme Federal Court determined that the government should elaborate a general plan for facing it, the pandemic, and it took 10 months to be released because the government had presented 4 versions and all of them were refuted due to the technical issues. And they have put an item about incentivizing the tourism in this confrontation plan. While we were going towards one direction, the government was going towards another. This plan took 10 months to be released, to be approved, have been homologated, and even with some issues. The government has created a plan to remove invaders from the Caripunas, Yanomamis, Araribóia, and other indigenous people, and this plan doesn't exist so far. So when the Supreme Court determined that the government should take measures, we saw in Munduruku that the government said they don't have the budget to do the operations, that they need an extra credit. So how does an entity like FUNAI, for example, that was projected to defend these territories, doesn't have in its budget a specific budget for this kind of operation. For us, it was really clear as well. Besides the matter of determining the government should assist all indigenous people. Doesn't matter if they were in a place that has a border established or not. We have even discussed cultural identity. The government was denying the cultural identity for indigenous people who are in lands that have been bordered, have been demarcated. FUNAI has made a resolution, number 4, about the ethno identification. And for a long time, the Brazilian Commission has adopted the self-identification criteria. And the Supreme Court has suspended it, saying clearly that this conduct violates their rights and is violent against indigenous people. Like, nobody can say who is or isn't an indigenous person. It's also a cultural matter. In APIB, people have organized it to confrontate it with specialists and people help with the support of teachers, academics, and universities, and it was essential to us. And it made a persecution process happening. FUNAI started asking federal police, starting investigations to investigate the main leaders, but not because they were committing any crime, due to they were committing defamation against Bolsonaro's government. Considering all these dimensions and others that we could discuss, we started taking this case through international organs. We took it to the Inter-American Commission and also to the International Criminal Court. So when we talk about it as a genocide in Brazil, we're not making a political use only about this law term, as many people are saying. Related to indigenous people, invalidate recognition of their land, their borders, and invalidate the production of these territories, you are actually not making possible they to follow their culture and subsistence. And it's a genocide crime in some aspects, especially related to isolated indigenous people, and also cultural crime, also crimes against humanity that you can also see in the execution and implementation an indigenous politics of a Brazil with no indigenous people. That's what Bolsonaro's politics propose. So us as native people are continuing to make this resistance with our leadership, and we would like to count on the support of the international communities and the scientific societies. That is why we're here in this space, bringing these reflections and also asking for support that we can make together some reflections and show the world what is happening to indigenous people and border communities, quilombolas, Black people in Brazil. And I thank very much this opportunity of bringing the issue to you, and I'm open to questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Luiz. Another very enlightening speak. We can see the size of the fight and the many dimensions and fields that are there. So all our solidarity and support to your fight. We're going now to our latest panelist, Lygia Sabbag. She's gonna have a presentation entitled Working Caring Survivor, the Gender Dynamics of Remote Work in Brazil under COVID-19. Lygia is a part of the, is a doctor through Unicam and represents young feminist economics youth group. It's called Feminists international society, and she organizes a work group about gender in young scholars institute, the YSI. She's also a part of the interdisciplinary group called LABIEM. I'm not sure if the pronunciation is correct, from USP. And her research is about politics economics, work economics, feminist economy, and Brazilian economy. So without further delay, I thank you, and the stage is yours. Thank you. Thank you, Pedro. First, I want to thank Oxbridge and Oxford Brazilian Society for the invitation, through Júlia Tainá, who has invited me. Thanking the interpreters. Without them, this work is always more difficult. And I also want to say that it was great hearing to Maria Sylvia and Luiz Terena, but it's a challenge for me, of course. So I hope I can contribute a little. So let's go. I'm going to share with you a presentation because I'm going to talk about a research I have done. So we have some data, and it probably makes it easier. Let me share with you. I think, can you see it? Okay, great. Thank you. So this article was published in this book called Handbook of Research on Remote Work and Worker Wellbeing in Post-COVID-19 Era. It's available. The text is called Working, Caring, Surviving. And I can share with you the article if you are interested. Just send me an email. My email is going to be available at the end of the presentation. You can send me and I'll share with you. Well, what I wanted to comment with you today is talking about sexual division of work, about the work and gender in pandemics, and showing a little of what we got with this questionnaire we have applied. So I'm gonna also talk about the limitations of this questionnaire, and try to make some final considerations and help us think and debate a little bit further. First, let's talk a little bit what is reproductive work. In my understanding, would be three things. We have the biological reproduction, the durational reproduction, so giving birth and breastfeed a child. So I'm gonna make it clear, these are the only two things from my point of view that only women can do. But reproductive work is not only that, it's really much, much more. We have the physical reproduction of human beings, like cooking, cleaning, ironing, taking care of your health, which is necessary and anyone could do. And we also have cultural and emotional reproduction, care with adults and children, and also education. I'm talking about all of that just to make clear that the sexual division of work is a social construction, and it transfers this home care only to women, even if it is paid or not. So I want to share with you a sentence of Nancy Fraser. It helps us think. So all this reproductive work made usually freely by women is indispensable for the society and for capitalism. So I think that's the link I would like to do here. That's not exactly the point we're going to discuss, but I think as a background, it is important for us to understand and think about it. So what is this non-paid reproductive work? It has some functions. It's going to subside the reproduction of the workforce. What the idea is, the workers, male and female, need to receive a compensation that makes them go back to work in the next day. If people had to pay all the care work that are made in a non-paid manner at home, if they had to pay to eat out every day, to wash their clothes, on a laundry, for someone to take care of their children, it would become really much more expensive. And it would do, the salaries, the minimum wages were higher. That's the way I'm saying that the non-paid reproductive work subsides the reproduction of the workforce. Another point I think is interesting is that this work, this reproductive work that is non-paid, will legitimize the subutilization of a part of the population as workforce, and that would be women. So there is no justify that a part of women need to be taking care of children. So we don't see, or we don't account a high percentage of unemployment, because these women are not at home by choice, but because they don't have anyone to leave their children with. There's another point, that is the idea of women as a reservation army. So while capital doesn't need women, the salary is low, and what we see as an opportunity cost in economics is not worth. So it's better for women being at home with their kids than paying for someone taking care of their children and them going out, because the salary they would receive would be really low and it's not worth. But if capitalism needs, maybe they increase the salary a little and bring these women to the workforce. So that's the meaning of women being a reservation army, always available in theory to start working if it's interesting to the capital. Some questions about paid work regarding women. They usually work in these typically feminine areas like health, care, education, cleaning, conservation. And these areas have really a lower payment, and then they can be combined with with a lower time at work, and they usually have more precarious jobs like food area, cleaning area, domestic workers, and etc. These works are called reproductive work, and they can be paid. What happened during the pandemic? We had many things going on. First, the reproductive work that is paid for women was hit in two ways. The first is that women were in the front line in health, in care, as supermarket cashiers, as house workers. It has a quote because there was a very big discussion that saying domestic worker or a house worker was or not an essential worker. We can return to that in the discussion because it's a very interesting one. But I would like to get your attention to think that pandemic helped us thinking on how essential this work is, but didn't help value the workers that execute this work. We haven't seen any salary increase for these women. We have only seen, oh, look how important they are. So we have this point, they were in the front line and they suffered more. Their health suffered more. And we had, on the other hand, women that had no income, like women who work in non-essential work, like hairdresser, manicure.
Therefore, women were doubled affected because they didn't have any paid work. So what happened with many of the women who did not lose their work is the creation, it was the growth of the remote work. But remote work is not new for women, because women have been doing that for a long time, because that enabled them to conciliate with the housework. In the pandemic, we also had the reproductive work, the non-paid reproductive work. And why that happened? Because all the civil market workplace, I'll say civil jobs or government jobs and restaurants, schools, they closed, and that increased the non-paid work at home. So if you look into all these issues, myself and my colleagues, Ana, Luisa, and Emilia, we created a questionnaire and we applied this survey in Brazil during the period of 26th of May to 15th of June, 2020. So this was at the beginning of the pandemic. At that point, we didn't know that the pandemic was going to last that long. I will tell you why we created this questionnaire. We at the time thought we are going to do this questionnaire because we didn't have anything like that being done in Brazil, and we decided to use the snowball technique. So this means that we ask people to complete the questionnaire, and the people will recommend others to complete the questionnaire. So we did not create a cohort or a group that we could analyze the cohort of race. This is a limitation of our methodology. And despite these limitations, we got very interesting insights. We had, at that point, 8.8 million people working remotely in Brazil, so doing remote work. And we had 455 responses. 99.6% of the sample were applying some sort of social distancing measure, and just over 81% were working. So we had more males than females saying that they were doing remote work. Another insight that we had is that 20 or just over 21% of the sample said that they were doing face-to-face presential work during the pandemic. What we've learned from this questionnaire. There was an increase of domestic work, and this for those respondents that were doing remote work increased. So the people that were doing remote work felt the increase on domestic work more strongly than those that were not working remotely. And the women in this group of respondents also felt it stronger. So we had 79.2% of women said that they felt an increase on domestic work compared to 73.7% of males. Women declared what we had there is like comparing male to female is that 11.5% of the women said this increased. So how they noticed this increased in the domestic work, but men also felt that, and the difference among men was of 13.8%. Within the group that were doing remote work, more women said that they were spending more time doing domestic work. And we look at, for example, in cooking, women, 77% of the women said that they were cooking more compared to males that said, to men that said 65.9%. And then we also looked into this when we talk about shopping sanitation, supermarket shopping, and washing clothes. Women, when we talk about those that were working in face-to-face presential work, the women also noticed that there was a difference in terms of time that they were spending doing the domestic work. But when we took at activities that it was about like cooking and washing clothes, the difference were not felt by any of the two groups, male or female. When we talk about caring for children and the elderly, we had difficulties in having substantial data in this area. But overall, the feeling of those that completed the questionnaire is that they felt that the time that they spent caring for children and elderly also increased. So what does that tell us? Well, we had a maintenance of the unequal division of domestic work and care work. And we also saw that women, 48.5 and 50.8% respectively, amongst women, and 13.3% and 17.3% for males, who declared that the domestic work increased at home, and also in terms of them doing the work on their own compared to other people in the house. So, and it seems to us, because the women declared that they didn't felt any difference in the pandemic, and the men also didn't have a perception of change among some of them when it comes to caring for others, it seems that it was maintained the status quo pre-pandemic. The responses in this survey show us that for those that were working remotely, it seems that they had an improvement in their situation. 33.3% of the women said that it improved the situation. And for both groups, male and females, said that there was a difference. So it seems that among the group that were working remotely, males and females said that the work were more equally divided. But when And then in some situations, what we had is the men working remotely and the women going out to do presential work. In that situation, the men were working more in the domestic work. So just to close this presentation, the frequency of domestic work increased for males and females. But when we come to care work, so caring for others within the household, the difference was not that conclusive. Those who were working remotely felt stronger the increase on caring for others, essentially, the increase of time caring for others. When we talk about the labor division, when we look at the labor division within the context of remote work, it seems to us that there was a better division of labor, of domestic work within the household. But actually, what happened, it doesn't mean that the women started to work less, so that the domestic work of the women reduced. It was just because it increased the domestic work during the pandemic, and then as a result, the men were working more. And we believe that actually the remote work, they can have increased modern work, and they probably made even worse, so they deepened the inequality of gender when it comes to domestic work. And the remote work is associated to the increase of care work. And we could not notice from this research, so we had like an increase of work, but there was no clear insight that this was being divided more equally. So the logical conclusion is that women were doing this work even further. So this is the last slide. And one of the final considerations that we believe for the future and to generate the debate is, what is the impact if you have people working remotely, and if the remote work becomes more disseminated post-pandemic, and this pre-pandemic segregation is maintained, so women are the ones doing more domestic work and working more remotely as well, it means that, according to our survey, this will end up deepening even further the gender inequality and the assignment of work, domestic work for all. Lygia, thank you. And this leads me to think how things have changed overall. Alexandre and Mariana, how do you want us to mediate the debate? So we are going to read the questions. Danielle is. Danielle will pick up a few questions that have been already published. Good evening, good afternoon for those of you in Brazil. The first question is from Ana Maria Silva. The question is, education was one of the activities that were more impacted by the pandemic. And the negative impact was stronger among the Black girls, who are the more vulnerable in terms of suffering violence and the deterioration of mental health. I would like to hear more about the Geledés study that was conducted about the impact of education in the life of Black girls in São Paulo. Could you please talk a little bit more about this? Anna, thank you for these. Anna, thank you for this question. I will put a link for all of you to access the survey. This was a survey that was conducted with 105 families, and all of them lived within the area of São Paulo city. They also heard a number of education professionals in 106 institutions, schools in São Paulo, and we were supported by some institutions that deal with child and young people. And one of the points that perhaps I could highlight here in this research that has been carried out is that when we talk about access to these materials or the learning materials that would enable the children to continue to study, what we've seen is that most people had access to this material in print format. So this material were collected from the school. So nearly 40% of the population had the material sent by post. So we were during the pandemic at that point, and many of these places were closed to enable the people really to go there and collect the material, the learning material. So what we noticed as well so when we talk about the Black girls, we had 30%, just over 40% of them had access to these materials, and the boys a little bit further, but among the white students, 100% of them had access to the materials. So this is another complicating factor. What we could learn from the research is that 66% of the families, and I'm talking about white families, they were accessing those classes online, and only 23%, so 23.81 to be exact, had access to the learning materials via computer. The Black families were accessing the internet via the mobile phone, and the family had just one mobile phone that they had, and this mobile phone is shared among all the siblings, mother, father, and that made it difficult for them to allow the children to learn via an online means. And that made hard not only the life of the children, but in particular, the girls, the Black girls. Another point that it was quite interesting in this research is looking at the number of hours that the girls were dedicating to their study. So when we look at the Black girls, they were not dedicated like 6 hours of study. And I think that Lygia has talked about something that we know. Girls, women, they are responsible for the care. They wash the dishes, they look after the house, they look after the younger siblings when the mothers are not at home. So if the mom are not at home, the schools are closed, the women, the girls are responsible for this household care. And that, of course, impacts on their availability to dedicate to study. So girls, and in particular, Black girls, had a harder time. They had difficulties in study during the pandemic. I have made the link for the study available to all of you. And basically, to sum up, that is the scope that we sort of gathered from the research. Maria Sylvia, thank you. Now the question is for Luiz Eloy. In your opinion, what is the perspective of the federal government in terms of taking accountability in the local and international level for the crimes committed against the indigenous during the pandemic? Do you think that there is a perspective of change the current status depending on the elect, or this will depend on the or this will impact on the next year electoral results? We have taken all these complaints to the different institutions, including international forums, and we cannot go anywhere else.
And we are also considering its agents. The FUNAI president, for example, is clear for us his responsibilization in that. And last week, we had started with a suit, the first civil suit proposed by indigenous people in federal justice, something innovated, and we have requested him to be taken off his functions. His name is Marcelo Xavier, and we brought a timeline from all the acts he have practiced since the beginning of Bolsonaro's government. There are abandonment, defense abandonment of indigenous communities, not defending their interests, persecuting the leaderships, and many things that were made in the context of this pandemic. We're still reflecting on that, and we are starting doing that. We have started about FUNAI's president, but for us, there's no doubt the Special Secretary for Indigenous Health, he was mentioned in our lawsuit, in our CPI, in the Senate, and even Bolsonaro, they were related to these conducts that have violated fundamental rights of indigenous people. Thank you, Luiz. I have another question to Lygia. In which way these findings of the research you have carried out can be an indication to a more permanent change, or if they are not, in any way, we are seeing a higher proportion of domestic work or a division in some points? Or do you think we can read it like that? Danielle, well, thank you for the question. And I have studied work shifts flexibilization for many years, and it was a matter that concerned me a lot, because I think flexibilizing that only means that the limits stop, the limits for which capital is exploring work. So now we are all the time, and we don't have a limit. And these home office and domestic work issues, we already had that. Women chose having home office in order to take care of children. And it's interesting that even before the pandemic, when you had men working in home office and women working in home office, their reasons are different. For the women, it's because they have to take care of children. And the man is like, oh, I don't need to leave home. It's more comfortable. Nobody interrupts me. So thinking that while a man says, I'm working from home because here nobody interrupts me. And when the women work from home, they work from home because they are going to be interrupted all the time. So there's a big difference. But it was a little bit limited because we were not used working in home office. Now, with this opening, it's a matter that really worries me. I don't know exactly how much it's going to change, but I think it has the potential of this change being permanent. And it's a change related to reducing working hours, redistributing domestic work and care work. And this change, I don't think we could experience so much. Individually, some couples have improved it because when the man used to be, or when the man is more at home, he has more condition to take part in that. It is an issue, sexual division of work. Men usually leave more often and are away longer. So when they are not at home, it's more difficult, like to give support to a child that is crying. But I think sensibilizing people is really far from what it needed to be in order for us to get a positive change. And my concern is that it's going to be just more of a burden for women, but also about the family in general. Because while we work at home, we work more and more. We didn't have a reduced journey. The capitalism can explore workers much more in general with a reduced cost. So I can't see that with positive eyes, with a positive look. So if you have another perspective, I will thank you for that, but I can't. Thank you again for your contributions. I think it's very interesting. We had more questions, but as we are a little bit ahead, a little bit late, so we are going to the end. I give the stage to Alexandre. Thank you again and good night. Thank you, Danielle. Pedro, would you like to make any comment to the panelists? Very briefly, I just want to thank you, really. Congratulations to the organization for bringing a set of panelists that is a group of panelists that is so rich, so diverse, and talking about fights and experience that are so important. I certainly learned a lot during the session. It was a pleasure listening. Thank you for your contributions. I end wishing you again solidarity and giving support to your fight, to the fights you have brought. Thank you. Thank you, Pedro. Before giving Mariana space to make final considerations, I thank the three panelists, and I want to give you 1 or 2 minutes. I would like to use 1 or 2 minutes to give you some considerations. In this moment that we have such a complicated moment in the country, many fights, it's hard to say which is the most difficult one. All of them are. So my question to you is, how do we make these fights get together? How do we gather them? With OPMS and the social forum, this is my research. So how do we connect these fights and give strength to the movements that need more and more be resistant in this scenario? So if you could end it with a perspective or a realistic scenario, or one perspective even that is positive, if you have this view for the future, I would thank you. Let's go with the same order. So Maria Sylvia, with final considerations, then Luiz and Lygia. I thank you for the possibility of being here. in this space. Some of our actions in the Black Coalition are thought in a way of strengthening indigenous people, because we have the matter of quilombolas that is very similar to the indigenous people that are having their land invaded. Recently, with the Black Coalition for Rights, we got a financial resources that were destined to remove quilombolas from Alcântara, Maranhão state due to oil activities. We made this being stopped. We got that. So in some way, every time that it's possible, we try to think and organize these fights as a group together. Environmental racism issue and others are very similar topics we have facing in this government. So I hope we can more and more gather and add things in these fights, in these topics, these issues, because stating the obvious and something that we repeat every time, together we are stronger. And when I talk about hope, I really use the verb hoping. We have to use this verb hope added to the verb fighting all the time. That's the only way we can stop all this situation we are living, and that is consolidating during Bolsonaro's government. But we know, and Eloy knows that we have these issues being like really ancient ones. We have been fighting against a state, a structured state, to exterminate us, to actually kill us. And Bolsonaro's government is a plus in this dynamic that the state has of acting against indigenous people, Black people. I think that is it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria Sylvia. Luiz? Thank you, Alexandre. There's a construction here beside me. I hope it doesn't disturb us, but I would like to thank for the invitation again and say that us indigenous people are doing this resistance, and it's important people in all the society, the civil society, everyone in their own dimension, get involved and be attentive to these signs that the indigenous people have given and the territories have given, because it's time for us to be in a point where there's no return. This is what we are taking to COP 2026, the need of respecting this territory and having this attentive observation about Brazil. We're ending another year. Next year will be a decisive year for us. So it's necessary that we are attentive to consolidate political forces to erase once and for all from Brazil's history and the political scenario this kind of conduct and person profile that were elected and are governing our country. We are resistant and persistent people, and we are going to go through these hard days and get better days. Thank you all very much. And with faith in our ancestors and our enchanted, we're going to win. Thank you. Thank you, Luiz. Lygia, please, your considerations. Thank you, Alexandre. I also want to thank everybody. It was really rich being here with you all. I was looking about Ana Maria's question. I won't be able to answer it, but just to close, I want to say what I think about it in general. In Brazil, we really need to value the workers, male and female. The paid and unpaid works. I think another issue that is very important that was left behind a long time ago was the work shifts. It's not a national, but should be an international fight. It's very hard to fight for that locally. How important the capital productivity has increased, and the working hours are increasing as well. I think it's important thinking about public policies to foment the division of care and domestic work. It's necessary having a conversation with the society, in the neighborhoods, places, to do it. And of course, a macroeconomical change and political change in a macro sense, because with this coming back, all this delay that this government has made, we're fighting against the tides, and we need other bases to be able to have more hope, as Maria Silva said, and expectations and real possibilities of an advancement. It's really hard to advance a little and then having all this coming back. I think that's it, always building something. Thank you again. Thank everybody for participating and for everything. Thank you so much, Lygia. Thank you, Maria Sylvia. Thank you so much, Eloy. I'm gonna say goodbye. I'll open the next room, and Mariana will explain now how the works presentation, the abstracts work. Good night, and thank you, everybody.
Alexandre.
Thank you, Alexandre. Well, to end, we would like to thank the panelists, Maria Silvia Oliveira, Luiz Eloy Terena, Lygia Sabbag Fares, also Pedro Loureiro by the moderation.
Palestras em diálogo extremamente interessante.
We had talks and discussions that were really interesting. Thank you for everybody that came here to watch. Thank you for the questions and the contributions. We're going to make a 10-minute break, and then we'll go to the presentation of the selected abstracts from the Brazilian Society, Economics Society. We're going to have 2 rooms, and Carla will explain to us about the technical part. That's it, guys. We're gonna have 2 rooms now. We have put here in the chat the abstracts for each room. So if you wanna go to room 1, participate in room 1, you just stay here in the Zoom link. If you wanna access room 2, that is also very nice. We're gonna check the works you have more interest. So for room 2, the Zoom link is here in the chat. To access room 2, just click on the link. So room 1, you stay here, and room 2 is right below room 1. You only click in the link. We're going to a fast break, but don't leave, okay? All the abstracts for the next session are very nice. And I'm saying goodbye. A big kiss for you all. I also need to go. I'm gonna teach soon. I would love to hear you more, but if you want, send me an email if I can help with anything, okay? Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Goodbye, guys. See you in 10 minutes, more or less. Hi, everybody. We are coming back. So let's go. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I would like to start saying that we have the support of a cross-lingual that you have listening. They are making the interpretation, the translation between English and Portuguese. So to select a language, click in this globe icon on your right corner so you can choose English or Portuguese. Now, yes, I'm gonna go to Portuguese. Welcome everybody to Oxbridge Conference in Brazilian Studies, organized by the Brazilian Societies of Cambridge and Oxford Universities. I'm Carla. I'm part of Oxford Brazilian Society, and I'm gonna be your host now for this Society and Economics panel. First, some notices. This event is being recorded. So we stimulate you strongly to make questions in our Q&A, the icon you have there at the bottom, so we can have an enriching and interesting debate after presentations. If you make any question, just please identify the panelists so we know who the question is directed to. Besides that, we have a poll. We're gonna send them in a few minutes between the first and second presentations, so we can control the presence and emit your certificates after the event. When it opens, you just need to choose if you would like to have the certificate or not. I have Bruna, Júlia, and Cláudia and Luana, Daniel and Pedro Silva presentations. If Bruna is ready, we're gonna start with her. Bruna, are you ready? Yes. So welcome, Bruna. I think we can see you. I'm having an issue with my camera. Is it okay if I present like that? No, it's okay. Are you going to be able to share your screen? Yes, I'm just opening it. Just a second. So I'm going to introduce you. First, Bruna is presenting about civil responsibility in aviation companies, the mitigation of major force and consumer rights in the delay or cancellation of flights in Brazil due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Bruna graduated in University of Londrina. So the stage is yours whenever you're ready. And if you're having an issue or need some time to connect your screen, we can start with one of the other girls like Júlia, Luana. Okay, I'm just opening it. All right, so we'll give you a minute. Can you see it? Yes, we are. It's opening, but oh, now yes. All right. Now let's go. We're just not seeing it full screen. Try to click present there on your right, so maybe we can see it. You can also use where you have more and less in the inferior bottom, the first one on the right. You probably can zoom to make the presentation full screen. Here on the top, the right, if you see there at the bottom, it's really down at the end of your screen. There, right there, exactly. You just need a second. Ready, there you go. Go ahead and get started. As Carla mentioned, I'm going to talk about the civil responsibility from aviation companies, mitigation of force majeure, and the consumer rights in canceling or delays of flights in Brazil due to COVID-19 pandemic. So COVID-19, caused by the new coronavirus, spread through the world and had a huge impact around the world with results not only in sectors like aviation, one of the most affected economically. The implications of the relation between the company and consumers has resulted some lawsuits, and the object would be the contract of transport faced to the pandemic. So the hypothesis we had here was that the major force should not be used to protect companies as determined by the Brazilian law, and the maintenance of civil responsibility for the corporations gives a lot of risks, gives space to a lot of risks that are known. I'm just going to give you a concept of the transport. So it's a one-off kind of transport between the companies.
And the contract is that he has to transport passengers, cargo, and post. So this is a manifestation of transport that have a number of economic situations that take people or things from a origin point to a destination. So this is a bilateral contract. It's formal, it is typical, and it is consensual, and it is based on result and why it is a contract, because it generates obligations, responsibilities on both sides in terms of collecting the passenger and deliver this person where it was agreed. It is a project it is a contract that it is onerous because there is an exchange of money, and it is a contract between consumer and provider because it is based on the passenger paying a specific amount of money to be transported to somewhere else. And the relationship is described in the civil code, and this is within the rights of the consumer, so the consumer rights. And in this code, it is not described specifically what it is, this relationship. So what the consumer code describes is just like what is the service, who is the buyer, who is the seller, and the different responsibilities, and gives the overall guidelines effects, direct and indirect, of what is the contract. So the consumer will exist only if there is the provider and the service itself. So this is contemplated in the resolution of ANAC, the aviation sector directorate in the country, and the Consumers' Right Code. Also, the Consumer Defense Code. The interpreter apologized. Consumer Defense Code. In the cases of interruption of service, we have a resolution in the Article 27 that say the material assistance should be offered by the transporter to the passenger if the passenger has been hindered or haven't received the service and had delays, even if the passenger is within still the aircraft for one period up to 1 hour, over 1 hour, 2 hours, and in the cases of 4 hours or overnight. So the first hypothesis here is the force majeure cannot be used to protect the companies according to the Article 27 in terms of when we talk about the pandemic. There is a law from August 2005 that in general lines say we cannot pay the fees and extension of reimbursement of tickets owing to unpredictable situations of force majeure. And many companies has already talked about this flexibilization in terms of rebooking journeys or trips. And in normal conditions, without the pandemic, the ANAC resolution 400 would means that the consumer contacts the airline company within 24 hours and provided the purchase had been made 7 days before the travel, this consumer will receive a reimbursement with 7 days after they enter with the complaint or with the request. But now with the new resolution, the rules of this service will be in terms of reimbursement of fines or credit. So the passenger, instead of receiving the money back, they will receive credits towards another ticket. And this applied to all tickets bought for traveling until December. The other hypothesis is that the responsibility, the maintenance of the civil responsibilities should be upon the corporation in face of this pandemic. In face of the known risks that are inherited to the commercial activity. So when a company commits to transport people from A to B, there is a pact. And all this pact, the judicial body of that company commits to transport the people from A to B based on a payment of a certain amount of money. And the company is responsible for the person and the goods during the period of transport. So the responsibility belongs to the corporation. And there is this civil responsibility towards the passenger. And any clauses that apport such a responsibility has to follow such a guideline. According to the Civil Code, is based on the presumption, and this is the presumption of guilt is based on evidence. So it is important to emphasize that the responsibility of the service is according to the CVC Article 14, and this is independent of apporting guilt for the provision of service or inadequate or inappropriate information related to it. The service provider assumes the responsibility of providing results. And the consumer, and the result is they will transport the passenger and his luggage in a safe way. And if they do not do that, this means that the company is not fulfilling its part on the contract. So the company has to accept the full responsibility for such a service and the responsibilities allied to these services. For this research, we use the inductive method and also historical documental research, looking into the objective civil responsibility. We also looked at some theoretical references, looking at the different codes that are applied to this area, from the Consumer Defense Code, the Civil Code, the Air Service Code, the resolutions and decrees published at federal level on this type of service. So what then is the force majeure and fortuitous case? So the meaning of fortuitous case for force majeure, we don't have a consensus in some of the legal experts. They see this as a reference of fortuitous case and force majeure has to be looked. The two concepts should be looked together, but others, they actually sign that fortuitous case is inherent to the activity, and force majeure is a non-intrinsic risk, something that will prevent the fulfillment of the obligation. Fortuitous case is seen by some as something that is totally unpredictable, and force majeure is something that is predictable but perhaps not avoidable. It is important to highlight that in our case law, there aren't much studies available looking to the difference of force majeure and fortuitous case. I can give you an example of force majeure here. You have a driver that is driving normal conditions of safety, and then his car is stricken by storms or by a lightning, and he's in the middle of the road, and then he ends up crashing into other cars. So in that case, this is not force majeure. It's a force of nature, so an act of God, but it is something totally unpredictable. the majority of the complaints at judicial level, they are much more complex than this example that I gave. And I can give you a case of, for example, we have a bird, we have a bird that is just sucked by the aircraft turbine. So let's say that it was a vulture. And this ends up delaying the flight for hundreds of people. In that case, the indemnization because of the flight delay against the company, against the airline company, can be made based on a fortuitous case. Let's say that someone did that because the vulture being sucked led him to get late wherever he was going, this passenger, and he has losses. So in that case, the justice see as not saying a fortuitous case, because the airline companies, that sort of thing happens all the time, and the company knows that that can happen. It is their responsibility. So the understanding, when we look at that, is when you look at the air transport and COVID-19, for example, the situation is different because the fortuitous case and force majeure can exclude the responsibility of the service provider. So the understanding is that the company still have the responsibility. If you look, for example, at what it was decided by the Justice Court at Paraná. They decided on 23rd of August 2021, and it was a case of compensation. And the company said that this was the airline company lost the case put by the passenger, because this passenger, he got delayed for 19 hours, and according to the Paraná Justice Court, his understanding was that the pandemic COVID-19 does not exempt the airline company to provide the material assistance to minimize the impacts to the passengers. And it is the obligation of the company to provide that. Olha, Adriana, nós já estamos fechando o tempo. Bruna, o tempo já está acabando. So, the objective of this research was to understand the maintenance of the civil responsibility in the airline companies towards the passengers. And the fact that the airline companies cannot use force majeure as a justification to not provide compensation to the passengers. Here are the references and the legal legislation that we researched to really get the information that support this research. Thank you. Very interesting, your research. Now, we are going to hear Júlia. Júlia, are you there? Júlia? Júlia research, which I am reading right now in English. Júlia is from Pernambuco University. Júlia, now you can have the mic. I would like to thank the opportunity to be here and talking about this work. This is something that I started to work with some time ago. Carla, I cannot see your PowerPoint. I cannot see your, Júlia, I cannot see your PowerPoint, says Carla.
and then you can send your PowerPoint to Ilana. She's checking. I'm sending you, Julia, my email here, so you can go. So Claudia is here too. Yes, I am. Then let's go. Claudia. Her presentation title is Where Are We Heading to? The Tourism Industry in Brazil and the Post-Pandemic COVID-19. So Claudia is a part of the Federal University of São Carlos, UFSCar. Let's see if now we can do it. Have a presentation here. Let's see, let's hope so. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I thank especially to the organizers for the thoughtful and kind communication during this process. I'm opening my presentation, okay? I'll just ask you if you are seeing my screen. Yes, we are. Everything okay? So let's get started. Right, so I'm a teacher at the Federal University of São Carlos, and some of my disciplines are about aspects that were severely affected during the pandemic. It's a very dynamic area. And fortunately, I have good news regarding when I sent this abstract. And that is why I'll justify that my corpus is formed by news that were posted by Brazilian and international newspapers. And those are trustful newspapers. And in Brazil, we need to clarify this kind of thing nowadays. Also, when I submitted my presentation, there were, the day before yesterday, there were new positive information. There were news about this tourism sector. So, as we know, Brazil was the second country that was most affected by the pandemic, and it obviously is connected to three aspects. Negationism, we have experience here in Brazil from the beginning until today, through all this pandemic process. The proposition of a precocious treatment that was proven not being effective, and the delay in acquisition of vaccines. It reflected in tourism, not only due to the pandemic itself, but also to the closing, the border closings with Brazil. People who were here at our trial moments saw Alexandre reporting the problems he's having back to Brazil, going back to the United Kingdom. Brazil was really affected by this absence of real pandemic confrontation policies, public policies. Of course, tourism was really affected. We can see here some authors that have already anticipated themselves, and since 2020 have been publishing studies that are very interesting in this direction. But unfortunately, some of them, in fact, we only have few studies in 2021. So I repeat that the corpus of this study comprehends news from newspapers, Brazilian and international papers. And some results will be presented due to selected news from this corpus. The impact in tourism happened in the aviation, and that with a lot of property has showed us this aspect of tourism, the speaker that came before me, but also other means of transportations had this impact, just like as travel agencies, cruise industry, food and beverage establishment, and also tourist attraction and tourist guiding services. The results also show some of these activities have reinvented themselves, others depended on public policies. For example, fundings that were more beneficial for the potential tourists, making installments. The research would also show the results that they will show that Brazil, in this period, Brazilian tourists ended choosing other tourism options, notedly regional, domestic, and more sustainable. We're gonna see why in the results. The results will be presented in 6 topics, which names were borrowed from the technical pandemic language. So we're gonna talk about contagion, diagnosis, symptoms, side effects, the drugs or medicines to fight the crisis, and the vaccines. Those are the topics that organize the research we are showing you. The contagious are those 3 aspects I have mentioned at the beginning. The negationism, the attack to science, like this article I exceptionally brought to you from a scientific paper. It shows not only the negationism, but also the attack to science. This is from a Brazilian author from Universidade de Pelotas University. Then we see the delay and resistance in the purchase of vaccines, diagnosis of this problem we are discussing, tourism. Brazil registers in October 603,000 victims, but happily, fortunately, as we are seeing now, things are moving towards an improvement to what seems to be the result of vaccination. Few sectors have suffered so much as tourism during the pandemic, in which we have finished buses in garages, planes on the ground, tourist attractions closed, packages canceled, and Brastoa, Brazilian Association of Tour Operators, have registered that was a decrease in the sales of travel packages in 50%, resulting in more than 1 million workplaces lost. The symptoms. At the beginning, coronavirus, we have predicted it should bankrupt 10% of hotels and 30% of restaurants. Besides that, a lot of terminations in the sector. Only one of the national companies like Latam have fired 2,700 pilots and flight attendants, a cut of 38% of their crew, people who work inside the airplanes. With MSC canceling, one of the main operators withdrawing from this kind of touristic product in Brazilian territory, the cruise season was canceled. And also, this article was published in the Argentinian newspaper Clarín, highlighting Argentina, that is the main place that sends leisure tourists to Brazil. They say that Rio de Janeiro was agonizing without tourists and without the carnival. The side effects. When it seemed the situation could get better, the new wave delayed the recovery of air companies. And also the Manaus variant made the neighbors got even more concerned of coming to Brazil and also having borders closed as mentioned. And also we have a new tourism modality that so far the ethics is being discussed, which would be the vaccine tourism, notably for Brazilians in the United States. This vaccine tourism has reached a lot of countries like Serbia, Russia, everything, and a lot of countries. the medicines to fight the crisis in tourism. First, we see that tour guides had to reinvent themselves because they were strongly impacted, because they worked with tourists in local, and they had to reinvent themselves, creating virtual tours. This modality will remain because even people who can travel can now use this virtual tourism service. It ended bringing a new modality to the market, and the sale of financed travel packages grows 310% because potential customers are going through a very strong financial crisis beyond having inflation. So we have financial installments about this package tours. Then we have regional tourism, very near to their city or even their state to avoid agglomeration, avoiding means of transportation, and we have a higher control about the tourism. Also, it matches the effects of the economical crisis regarding the tourism's demand. Also, the domestic tourist is the same. For example, now with the opening of the main polos of tourism, for which Brazilians used to travel, that are Argentina, Portugal, and United States, the rules can change from one moment to the other. So it causes a little insecurity. So even now that these borders are open, Brazilians are choosing domestic tourism and also sustainability, which is a very good surprise because sustainability is what every tourism professional that is responsible and ethical goes after, chases. Sustainability in tourism, going to natural environments with responsibility, it's also a medicine to this crisis. And the last one, vaccines to reopen the tourism industry. So fortunately, here Deutsche Welle has put some news about it in July, that 94% Brazilians were open to be vaccinated, which is a very good surprise in a country where the president has fought against the vaccine and attacked it. That is very different from what we see in countries like the United States and even European countries like Italy, where there's a lot of resistance to vaccination. The Brazilian airlines start to demand COVID vaccine from their workers and soon from the passengers. And we see the same company that had fired is already rehiring 750 employees and forecasts almost 100% of their tourism offer. And now in October, it was authorized the retake of the cruise seasons in Brazil. And the advancement of vaccination releases tourism and predicts getting back the trips for our holidays and the end of the year. Just to tell you, have a few more minutes. I'm ending, okay? So the same countries that had closed strongly their borders to Brazil had reopened and not only fight for Brazilian tourists because they depend on the Brazilian demand, Portugal and Argentina. And at the end, we have an increase in formal employment. Only in São Paulo state, from October to September, it had increased in a very, it has spiked with more than 4,000 formal jobs created only in São Paulo state. On the other hand, we have the risk of a reincidence because Rio is allowing maximum capacity at fairs, events, and leisure attractions. So maybe it's premature. I conclude that. Thank you for your attention and bring again the effects we have seen through the presentation. And to conclude, vaccine has proven to be the best medicine to cure the serious disease that has severely affected the Brazilian tourism industry during the COVID pandemics. Here I have the reference, and thank you very much. If you have questions, I'll be available at the end. Thank you very much, Claudia. Very interesting how the two presentations had a synergy. So I think we can have a very nice debate at the end. I remind you that we still have more presentations, but if you can make the questions in the Q&A, we're waiting for your questions. So now, Júlia, we can see your presentation. I have your presentation here. I'll share. And when you want me to change the slides, okay? All right. So let's go. So I'll just remind a little bit about Júlia's profile, because it's been a while we have said it. So her work is called Volunteering Management in Brazilian Third Sector Organizations, Tendencies After the Pandemic, and Júlia is from Pernambuco University. Okay, you can change, Ilana. Thank you. This work is a result of our research.
So this work is the result of my BA, and I have updated the data with COVID data. So the third sector, we have perhaps to explain a little bit about what is the third sector. The first sector is the government, the second is the business, and third, we have the social organizations, and they are diverse, and they have different names and different ways of classifying themselves. We know that in Brazil, many international organizations had come to the country, but the institution of these organizations, and in this third second, it was actually in the 80s, in the 1980s. The 80s were very important for Brazil. It was the time that we had the federal constitution, the latest federal constitution, and many of them were really based on human rights. It was when Brazil started to organize this sector, including the law, 19 the law 9608 from 98. It was very important there. And when we talk about this, the third sector here, we have a sector that works with volunteers and have 4% of the population older than 14 years old working in this sector. We have hundreds of thousands of civil societies organizations in the third sector. So the number exact is 800,400 associations. And it is important to highlight that these workers in the third sector are volunteers. And we have to highlight that in the context of the pandemic. Brazil is going through a crisis since 2008. This is an economic and social crisis. And what we have noticed since that time is the reduction of the volunteers in the third sector. We had year on year having a reduction on the number of people working as volunteers in the third sector. So it is important to have theoretical concepts to support these organizations. One of the theories on this area is from Harry Fayol, and The organizations from the third sector, they are not different from companies or from the government. They also need to have planning, organization, commanding, coordination, and controlling. And how can the third sector benefit from this process management theory? And the environment of the third sector needs to be professional, needs professional people in this area, and the managers, they do have to have an interchange of knowledge so they can generate knowledge for this area. They have to share practices, and in the third sector, these organizations need to modernize their practices, not only in terms of information technology, but also in terms of development of strategic management. So they need to do that to improve not only the quality of the people that work in improving personnel, but also improve in terms of investment. So this strategy is very important. And as a result, we are going to have then the institutionalization of the processes. And by doing that, we understand that there are several phases that must be followed by a manager, from the planning of the roles and function to the recruitment, up all the way down to the developing and training and understanding what the people can bring to the third sector. So one problem that you have in the third sector is that some just think that the person can come to the third sector and offer whatever they want to do. And I've been a volunteer myself. However, it is needed to have a work in this area in terms of the process. The process help us to understand the decisions of the company. And all decisions taken must be objective. It must have goals, and it must understand what are the resources available to achieve such goals. So within this perspective, I brought here just a little sample of that is shown in this table, where it shows the number of donations worldwide. And when we talk about donation, is investment, financial donation, and personal as well. When we look at Brazil, Brazil is, well, Brazil is placed 68th on this table in terms of time donation. And this is not much considering the magnitude of the country's size and population. So sometimes, of course, this happens because people, they rather do not do donations to an institution. They rather donate directly to the person that they believe that needs such a help. So I brought a few data about these donation research, looking at the trends of Brazilian institutions in this area from 2015 to 2020. What we have noticed is that the support to initiatives and organizations with social and environmental causes reduced by 46%, which it was in 2015 to 37% in 2020. The good news, though, is that actually people are more open to hear from these type of organizations, or organizations that are linked with these causes. So 74% of the population see the third sector as necessary to help social and environmental problems. I will talk about the emergency fund that it was created for health. And this is one of the solutions that we have short term. So when we talk short term, this emergency fund was created to deal with issues, health issues, and it was provided to organizations that deal with health. For example, I have a data here that institutions that deal with health and children are the organizations that receive more donations. But now this is different. Organizations that are dedicated to combat food and poverty, they are receiving 43% of donations. So this is a trend that, this is a changing trend, and this is quite important to be aware of, because many of the organizations in this area, they stopped their work. So some of the organizations that were looking after children, providing education, these organizations that did that before the pandemic, in the pandemic, they just became an organization that provided food for these people. So nowadays, we also have different platforms, online platforms that is to create opportunities for donation. And this change on the paradigm in this area is quite important in terms of trends in the third sector. Another trend, recent trend, is the virtual volunteering, not just fundraising. Oh, I am the one that is looking after the time, so I am the timekeeper. So sorry about that, Tainá. Just to say that you have a few more minutes. Not a problem. Tainá continues. So my work is that, and we are still in this very difficult economic and social crisis. We have a large number of people that are employed or are working in the volunteering sector. But when we look at these changes, but this youngster that wants to volunteer, they cannot do that. And of course, the youngsters, they tend to be more idealistic, but then they can't because of the whole context of social and economic crisis that we are living through at the moment. Brazil is back to the hunger map. So we are talking about the professionalization of this sector, but unfortunately, we still have to go a few steps back to deal with these specific issues that have been happening in the social environment, the social landscape of the country. So this is what I am researching, and for all of you who are interested, please feel free to get in touch. Júlia, thank you very much. I could hear all of you for the all night long, but as I said, I am the timekeeper. I will be the nasty person that will be reminding you of the time all the time. Now we're going to hear Luana. Luana is from the Federal University of São Paulo. And you've just heard the title of her work. And she will provide us an analysis from 2002 to the beginning of the COVID. So let's hear Luana. I would like to thank all of you for this opportunity to do this presentation.
It sure enriches my research. So introducing myself, I'm Bruna Dias de Oliveira. I study economic sciences in the Federal University of São Paulo. This one is part of my scientific initiation research funded by FAPESP and oriented by Professor Solange Lede Gonçalves. It's about domestic work and the economic cycles in Brazil, an analysis since 2002 to 2019 COVID pandemic in Brazil. The historical context is part of understanding the domestic work as the core of social and economical development and the importance of that for the capital reproduction. So having a social and academic invisibility through the marginalized groups, individuals that inside the system kind of don't matter. The study has as an analysis object the characteristics and conditions, the socio-economical conditions from domestic work in economic cycles in Brazil between 2002 until the arrival of COVID-19 pandemic. The objective is understanding and analyze how economic movements, crises, and expansions from 2002 until the current pandemic crisis in COVID-19 determine work conditions for domestic workers in Brazil. Specific objectives are literature revision about feminine work market in Brazil, a history of domestic work in the world and specifically in Brazil, comparing it to developing countries. Also, the construction of a sample of domestic workers using microdata from PNADC and PME, formulating descriptive analysis to determine the demographic and socioeconomic profile in domestic work during the analyzed period, and also the econometric analysis between the transitions inside and out of this occupation, the total participation of the workers in domestic work in Brazil, and the salary of these women in this work. All of that also understanding the economic scenario. The methodology are theoretical frameworks based in social and historic scenarios that allow making a reading of the contemporary scenario and the descriptive and econometric through the databases PME, PNADC, and PNA COVID that I will have in the next slide, referring to the methodology. In the methodology, we have literature review to contemplate their theoretical framework and an innovation of two different databases inside IBGE, PME and PNDC. PME is used for 2002 to 2012, and it covers six metropolitan regions in Brazil: Recife, Salvador, Belo Horizonte, São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Porto Alegre, and has a monthly panel with rotation of households in which a same household will be analyzed for 4 consecutive months, removed for 8 months, and studied again for 4 more months. The microdata from PNDC are going to be analyzed through 2012, from 2012 to 2020, and it gets all the national territory. It's a quarterly longitudinal basis with a rotational panel, and the household selected will be a sample once by quarter for 5 consecutive quarters. And this analysis is part of the equation representing each of the 3 possible analyses: the participation of women in this analysis, the transition in and out of this occupation, and the salary of these women in the market. So X will be an analysis vector of characteristics observable in the individuals and also contains the variables that capture economic floatings. This X will bring, for example, race, gender, color, age, kids up to 6 years old or from 7 to 14 years old, being the provider, having a spouse, years of education, region, and also the GPD. It will bring a more directional analysis to the economic scenario. There is also regression error because some variables are not observed inside this equation. So the theoretical framework, we're gonna have the perspective of the majority of the workers being feminine. They are in occupations that have low level and low education. And we're gonna see the periods of economic movements, and we're gonna treat this gender and capital formation movements, economic movements, when we talk about the foundation of the society, the capitalist society, with the feminine work. So we have a segregation, occupation segregational, with unvalidating women and not valuing them, reducing this matter to a love issue. We're gonna consider then the slavery period in Brazil, rooted in this matter through the intersection based in race up to date, what produces a proper dynamic for poor and Black people. We are maintaining this marginalized profile regardless the economic process, since they were not reformulated in this precariat place and also not reformulated for these individuals. About the results of the descriptive analysis, the composition of the graph gender race of domestic work 2002-2019 will prove the profile of non-white women. So we can see women are 90% of the occupation. And something important to observe is that the importance, the relevance of this occupation in the feminine work market, since we have 6 million workers in Brazil, and it's the second biggest occupation in our country. Another aspect to be considered is the racial definition of the domestic work, because non-white women are twice the number of white women, what corroborates with our historic scenario. We also have the perception of the maintenance of the occupation by marginalized and the offer of this work, because we're going through a social transformation, constructing a well-being, a social well-being, and some educational policies. So for this analysis, the recession periods would mean only these workers being terminated without another perspective. But in growth periods, with the improvement of the market and the upper class and medium class families, they start hiring people again. So your time is up. All right, I'm just finishing. So just talking a little bit about the pandemic and going to the conclusions. So nowadays, in the pandemic, we have more precarity, insecurity of this occupation, and it's not viable having this occupation. It is given through the social distancing, the lockdown. So people are domestic formal works and no rights, so they leave the job with any income initiated to the inefficacy of public policies, food insecurity, and it makes women being it's really precarious. And the construction of this reality with these theoretical tools and economic analysis I could do through the econometric measures. And the goal of this study is to contemplate this area, and in this period could not contemplate the data. It's an important point because the visibility of this area is necessary to formulate public policies for these people who represent millions of Brazilian workers and now live a humanitarian and sanitary crisis. So some references for you. and the contacts in case you have any contribution. Thank you very much for your attention. It's very interesting, so thank you, Luana. And now, sorry, people, we're gonna go a little bit late. We only have one more presentation, then we'll have a quick debate. So we are now with Pedro and Daniel here. Daniel Fentos and Pedro Silva. They are students in the Law School of Uberlândia. They are also researchers in the same university, in the study group of international law and also in the human sciences laboratories. Their work is so guys, you can get started. Good afternoon. There is a banner we have sent by email.
There is a banner that we've sent via email. Do you want to share it? Daniel, Marcelo? So can you do, Marcela, can you do the presentation? Can you start without the banner? Yes, I can. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Pedro. I work at the Federal University of Uberlândia. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for those organizing this event. Thank you to Marcela and also our supervisor, Dr. Jack Balloon. Our work is about COVID-19 and between intellectual property and the rule of humanist law in favor of the right of life. We carried out this research to understand this debate. So what is the intellectual property that is protected by patent and the rule of humanist law that is in favor of the right of life? We create a deductive hypothetical method to carry out this work. And we carried out a literature review of other authors who looked at this topic. Our aim was to investigate if the harm caused by COVID-19 and the fact that it affected the world in different levels. So there was an inequality of the damaged cause, and looking if this would overcome the intellectual property, so the intellectual property and the judicial law that protects the COVID-19. And we looked at the international perspective of and looking at the international law that is accepted by the international law. So, and the right of life, if that, so the humanist law in terms of right of life, or if it surpasses all the judicial and the cases of law related to the protection of COVID-19. Based on the humanist law, the master rule, the right of law, can perhaps surpass the laws of patent and provide the cure for those that are being most affected by COVID-19. So this is what we've been researching. And we have Daniel will talk a little bit further about this. Can you hear me? Asks Daniel. Marcia, please go to relevance. Good afternoon, all of you. I am Danielle Urias. I am a law student and at Uberlândia Federal University. I would like to greet all my colleagues here and all the others present here. I will talk a little bit about the relevance of our study before we talk about results. We know that the pharmaceutical industry is directly connected to technological innovation and intellectual property and activities that are protected by the patent institute. So they do protect the methods of development of COVID-19, which are being developed, and the vaccine is being developed by the large pharmaceutical companies in the global south. So this aligns with the international law, and the relevance of our studies is to question the rationality of patents in medications and immunizing drugs that could significantly that could reduce in a significant way the rates of death and contaminations around the globe, particularly in countries at Latin America and the Caribbean area. So these countries have historically suffered more than others. They have deficiencies, and in the pandemic that was made worse. When we look at the results generated by our research, we could see that, considering that COVID-19 is a disease that affected all countries and very few countries have the technology that is strong enough to develop these vaccines, we can safely conclude that this is one of the strongest challenges that the international community had to face during this period. To really overcome the disease, the global community, they have to guarantee that all countries have a vaccination program, and in particular those countries who do not have political or economical capital to really institute such a vaccination program. So we have, for example, the recommendations that it was made by the World Health Organization and the efforts of the different organizations in bringing cooperation in the development of the vaccine, not only in the General Assembly of 2020, and apart from that, different efforts were made to break down the patent of these vaccines. Considering that COVID, that reached all the countries in the world, and some countries do not have technology to develop such a vaccine. So the global community, they do have an this vaccine. The countries that cannot afford such a vaccine in the global south, they are based in the Caribbean area and Latin America. And these are the countries that started the vaccination program late and became the epicenter of the pandemic. One of our main conclusions in this study is the fact that the compulsory license is an important concept to trade off the consequences of economic globalization, which enables better regional integration between countries and speeding up the overcoming of the crisis. And consequently creating better access to the vaccine itself by breaking the patent. So this is the work that we are doing. It is, we are dealing with a specific cohort on this, a specific sample within this research. And this research is a part of a larger study where we are looking at all these issues. Thank you for the opportunity to mention about this work that we are carrying out, and I am open to any questions that you may have. Thank you, Daniel. The work that it was presented here is very interesting. We have a few questions here. We are already over time, but then let's have at least a 10-minute debate.
Especialmente para as agências de turismo. Então, eu imagino que tenham vindo para ficar. No que diz respeito à questão espacial...
And companies. In relation to the geographical tourism, so regional and domestic tourism, this will maintain itself and this will perhaps suffer an impact when the international tourism is open to everybody. Many of those who can afford an international trip, even if it is to Argentina, they are not doing that now because, for example, those that travel to Argentina, we are still in a positive situation, but those that can afford to travel at the moment, they are not being able, they are not affording to travel because of the exchange rate against the dollar, the prices of flights, even if you talk about going to Argentina. So nowadays, a ticket to fly to Argentina is about 3,000 reais. So it is a bit of an absurd sort of prices that is going on. However, as soon as this situation changes and people can afford to travel more internationally, that will impact on the regional tourism. What it was the other question? Well, the second question is in terms of the internal changes in the tourism industry. And the second question is do you have any data on the type of tourism that has been impacted here in the country? Are we talking about leisure tourism? Is medical tourism? Is immigrant or immigration tourism? Are there differences in terms of families or origin or country of origin? No, I haven't seen any difference apart from what I have observed by reading in the newspapers. What we see in the media is that they're talking about the impact on the tourism companies and restaurant, hotels, and those outlets that sell bills, so that sell drinks. So we had some sort of norms for partners that were living in different countries. They were separated, or for children visiting their parents, they were allowed to enter the country. When we talk about medical tourism, of course, there is a suppression at the moment. We believe that when the situation became better, this medical tourism will restart again. In relation to the internal issues, sorry, what it was the question? Well, I want to know is if the question was, the internal changes are impacting on behavioral changes. Well, your question is not very clear. I don't know if you're talking about the environmental, the hearts at the moment, sorry. The person can contact you directly to ask this question. Yeah, I'm gonna leave my email in the chat, and then please get in contact with me so we can discuss this further. Bruna, a question to you. This question is to Bruna. Cynthia is asking, could you please comment a bit further on the decision-making effects of opening to the consumers the option of postpone, not canceling flights with the airlines? Well, this option already exists, and this is the period of extensions is until 2022. And there was an extension of this time, not only in terms of time, and this became law, and people can postpone instead of canceling the ticket. One other question that goes to Luana. Actually, there is another question that is for Pedro, Daniela, and Marcela. Vera is asking, it is very important, this debate about patents. You talked, have you looked at data and the debate about the access to medication for AIDS in Brazil? And Brazil was the pioneer and defended the social movement of people living with AIDS. So I want to know if you looked at this in the context of your research. We did not do a direct analysis, but we looked at this situation, at this issue. We looked at the studies from Professor Tatiana Scaffi, and she does this comparison of breaking the patent for COVID-19 and the development of drugs for the AIDS, taking into account the global emergency of the disease and the impact at global level. So this is something that is going, some more will be published in this area by Professor Cláudia Moreira, and Professor Tatiana Scaffi also talks about, studies this COVID-19 in comparison with the development of retroviral drugs for AIDS. I have a question for Luana. I would like to understand a bit further about the precariousness of domestic work and the issue of formality. Does formalizing this type of job helps the sector? How do you see that? This is a very good question. This is something that I have studied, in fact. When we talk about the formalization, or say make it formal, the work of domestic workers, it was a moment of labor conquest. Getúlio Vargas, during the time of Getúlio Vargas, this was already debated, but only in 2015.
algum aumento nos programas de voluntariado no setor da saúde, enfim, de direitos humanos ao longo desse período de pandemia? Não sei se existem dados.
During this pandemic, I don't know if you have access of such data or if that happened. Thank you for this question. What we've noticed is...
So, of course, health had to mobilize, especially financially. As I told you, the emergency funding resources we had. This was the first thing we thought, because many things was paused, stopped due to the risk of volunteers being there in the hospitals and everything. So we see something that is very strong in Brazil, especially with clowns that visit kids in Brazil, and this kind of movement has becoming stronger and stronger, and thank God, because it humanizes people's treatment, but many things were stopped during the pandemic. So according to data, I was looking for them to see if I had them here, but
now, Ivan,
Brazil, if you want to have access to that, it's in the EHESS website. I can even put it here for you so you can see it. But regarding donation, time and also amounts, it was really reduced. Everything was reduced. Can I share with you? I don't know if I'll be able to share it, but so we don't have much time, but if you can just tell us the main topics, please, it's gonna be great. Okay, so everything was reduced. Regarding the donation time, donating them time from 2015 to 2000, people have corrected research went from 36 to 40% people who responded to the questionnaires. And the cause that has more, giving a sensibility to people. In 2015, health was really ahead. 40 people felt more sensitive to donating to health. And unfortunately, this year was around 10% of people felt more inclined to donate. So it was more of an informal thing. Not the organization itself, but informally, people trying to contribute. Okay, that's all very interesting. That would be it, people. We really need to end for now. Things got a little bit late, but we would really like to thank you, Bruna, Júlia, Cláudia, Luana, Daniel, Pedro, and Marcela, for all your talks and explanations that were really elucidative. We also thank the Brazilian programs of the Oxford University, Lema Foundation, and Brazilian Studies Associations, who are our partners, and especially everybody who's still here and dedicated all this time for us, watching the debate. So thank you for your questions, thank you for attending, and thank you for your contributions. We would like to give this final information that we still have panels on Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday next week about public policies, environment, and education. So our programming is in our website, oxbridgebrazil.com. That is it, guys. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Good afternoon, people in Brazil. So good night, everybody. See you next week. Bye-bye.